Everyone knows how Stalingrad ended. The German Sixth Army sealed in a city, starved. But the trap that caught them was not aimed at the Germans at all. It was aimed at their friends. On the 19th of November 1942, the Red Army did not throw its weight at the strongest wall of the ring. It went looking for the softest seam. And it found one. 40,000 men holding a stretch of frozen ground north of the city, wearing a different uniform and carrying guns that could not do the job. This is the story of the Romanian Third Army. The wall the Germans built out of an ally they would not arm. And the 4 days it took the Red Army to prove that the whole thing was rotten from the start. Start with the map, because the map is the crime. By the autumn of 1942, the Germans had pushed almost the whole way into Stalingrad. Street by street, factory by factory, they were grinding through it. But every mile they drove east stretched their flanks thinner. Somebody had to guard the long, open ground on either side of the city. The Germans did not have the men to do it themselves. So they handed the job to their allies. To the north of Stalingrad, along the Don River, they put the Romanian Third Army. Romania was the largest ally Hitler had on the Eastern Front. More than 300,000 Romanian soldiers had marched east into the Soviet Union. Their commander on the Don was a careful man named General Dumitrescu. He looked at the ground he had been given and he did the math, and the math frightened him. His army was told to hold a front about 85 miles long. That is not a defensive line. That is a rumour of one. A man every so many yards and long cold gaps in between. Worse than the length was the equipment. The Romanians were sent to stop Soviet tanks, and the guns they carried could not stop a Soviet tank. Their main anti-tank weapons were the 37mm and the 47mm gun. Both of them bounced off the sloped armour of a T-34, bounced clean off. The Germans knew this. So they handed over a few heavier 75mm guns, but only 6 per Romanian division. Set that against the ground. One gun that could actually kill a tank for every 2 miles of front. Between those guns, the men were told to stop armour with grenades, mines and bottles of gasoline. And think about who was holding those bottles. The Romanian Third Army was not a force of trained tank hunters. It was built mostly from peasant conscripts, farm boys pulled off the land, many of them poorly fed before a single shot was fired. Their divisions moved on horses and carts, not trucks. Their winter clothing was thin. They had sat in the line for weeks on short rations out on the open steppe, and the real Russian winter was only starting to bite. These were the men both plans had picked out. Not because they were cowards, because they had been set up to lose. Dumitrescu saw the real danger from a long way off. The Soviets held 2 bridgeheads on his side of the Don River at Serafimovich and at Kletskaya. Little footholds on the wrong bank. Dumitrescu understood exactly what they were. They were the doors the enemy would come through. From August onward, he begged. He went to German Army Group B, then to the German High Command, asking for help to push the Soviets back across the river before the winter came. "Clear the bridgeheads," he said, "or they will kill us." The Germans were looking the other way. Their eyes were fixed on the rubble of Stalingrad, on the last few blocks, and a threat 150 miles to the northwest did not interest them. They left the doors open. They left the Romanians standing in front of them. And on the far bank, in those bridgeheads Dumitrescu had begged to clear, the Red Army was quietly stacking up everything it had. The plan was called Operation Uranus. It was built by the men at the top of the Soviet command, and its whole genius was in where it chose to hit. Not the Germans. Never the Germans, not first. The Soviet planners had studied the ring around Stalingrad, and they saw what the Germans refused to see. The strongest army in the world was standing behind a fence, and the fence was held up by the weakest posts on the field. Hit the posts, and the whole thing falls, and the strong army falls with it. Against the Romanian Third Army, the Soviets massed the 1st Guards Army, the 5th Tank Army, and the 21st Army. Almost 6,000 artillery pieces. More than 700 tanks. Nearly 800 aircraft. All of it pointed at men with bottles of gasoline. And the Romanians barely saw the true weight coming. The Soviets moved at night and hid by day, bringing the tanks and guns up into the bridgeheads under cover of the dark and the frozen fog, so the real size of the blow stayed hidden almost to the last hour. The men in the Romanian trenches knew something was building on the far bank. They did not know it was the largest hammer the Red Army had yet swung. It began before dawn on the 19th of November. The steppe that morning was buried in a frozen mist, a cold white fog that sat on the ground and hid everything. For the Romanians, that fog was a blindfold. For the Soviet gunners, it was nothing at all, because they had already ranged these targets in the weeks of small probing attacks before. They knew where the Romanian trenches were, without needing to see them. At 5:30 in the morning, 3,500 guns opened at once. The bombardment ran for 90 minutes. 90 minutes of shell fire walking up and down positions the men could not defend and could barely see out of. Romanian gun crews tried to answer and could not. They had no targets in the fog. The enemy had all of theirs. When the shelling lifted, the tanks came out of the mist. There were Romanian soldiers who did not run. That has to be said plainly, because the easy story is that they simply broke, and the easy story is a lie. In the centre, some units held through the first day and through the first Soviet attacks back. A sergeant named Manol Zamfir in the 36th Regiment remembered the strangest part of that morning. The Soviets were calling out to them across the snow, and they were calling in Romanian. "Brothers," they shouted, "why are you killing us?" Brothers. It was aimed straight at the thing every man out there already half knew. That this was not their war. That they had been marched 1,000 miles from home to die on a river they had never heard of, for a city that was not theirs, in front of guns that were not enough. The line held for a few hours, and then it did not. The 5th Tank Army had orders to punch through on a narrow front, only about 4 miles wide, and put every tank it had into that 4 miles. Between noon and 1 in the afternoon the spearhead went through the Romanian 13th and 14th Divisions and out the other side. The 37mm guns fired, the shells skipped off the T-34s, and the tanks kept coming. Once armour is behind a line, the line stops being a line. It becomes clumps of men in the open, with tanks driving between them. What that looked like on the ground was men fighting tanks with their hands. With no gun that could stop a T-34, small groups of Romanians did the only thing left to them. They let the tanks grind over their trenches, then came up behind them with mines and grenades and bottles of burning gasoline, trying to jam a track or set an engine deck alight. A few of them managed it. Most did not. A man with a grenade against 30 tons of moving steel is not a fair fight, and every soldier in that snow knew it. The line did not break because the men were weak. It broke because the tools were a lie. You can hear the day fall apart in the radio traffic. A Romanian officer named Lieutenant Colonel Dumitrescu sent a message on the 19th that still tried to sound steady. "I am optimistic," he said, "even if we will lose some of our forces." 2 days later, on the 21st, the same man had one word for headquarters. Critical. A German pilot flying overhead put it more cruelly. This was Hans-Ulrich Rudel, a Stuka flyer, and he looked down and saw masses of Romanians racing for the rear, some throwing away their weapons. It is an ugly picture. It is also the picture of men who had been handed an impossible piece of ground with the wrong tools and then written off before the first shot. By the end of the 20th of November, the Romanian Third Army was in full retreat, and the Red Army was not even stopping to fight the German infantry divisions in its path. It was flowing around them, pouring south and east toward a town on the Don called Kalach. Kalach was the hinge. If the northern Soviet spearhead reached it and shook hands with the southern one coming up from below Stalingrad, the ring would close, and everything inside the ring, the whole German Sixth Army, would be trapped. Nothing now stood between the Soviet tanks and that town except the wreckage of an ally. And the north was only half of it. 1 day later, on the 20th of November, the second Soviet pincer came out of the south, and it too came down on Romanians. This time, the Romanian Fourth Army below the city. Both jaws of the trap closed on the ally. Not one weak flank but two, with the Germans safe in the middle for one more day. In just the opening days of the offensive, the northern spearhead swept up something on the order of 27,000 Romanian prisoners. 27,000 men taken off the board before the ring had even finished closing. Whole regiments walking into captivity through the snow while the tanks rolled past them toward Kalach. And in the middle of that wreckage, about 40,000 Romanian men found themselves surrounded. They were the leftover pieces of 5 shattered divisions, the 5th, the 6th, the 15th, and torn parts of the 13th and 14th, with an armoured division mixed in. Cut off, with the enemy on every side. Command of this pocket fell to a major general named Mihail Lascar. Lascar was not a paper officer. He had already won the Knight's Cross, and the men around him would come to call the pocket by his name. The Lascar Group. He pulled the surrounded units into a tight defensive knot, a hedgehog, guns pointing out in every direction, and he told them to hold. Here is the arithmetic that decided everything. 40,000 men. And by this point, each gun in the pocket had roughly 40 rounds left. 40. That is a few minutes of real firing and then silence. No food coming in. No ammunition coming in. No fuel coming in. The pocket could shoot for a little while longer, and then it would be 40,000 men holding empty rifles in the snow. Everyone inside the ring understood that the only move left was to break out west now, while there was still strength to move and a few shells to cover it. Lascar asked for permission to break out. The answer came back, no. It came from the very top, from the Romanian leader Ion Antonescu, and it was the same disease that had killed the flank in the first place. Hold at any cost. Stand where you are. Do not move. The men who could have saved themselves were ordered to stay in the trap and wait. On the afternoon of the 22nd of November, the Soviets offered the Lascar group a way out that did not involve dying. They asked for its surrender. The answer that came back was short. We will continue to fight without thought of surrender. Read that in the cold light of what they had. 40 rounds a gun. No food. No hope of relief. Guns that could not kill the tanks parked around them. And still, no. It was not a smart answer. It may not even have been a sane one. But it was not the answer of men racing for the rear, throwing away their rifles. Both of those things were true of the same army in the same week, and both of them belong in the story. That same day, the 22nd, the ring around Stalingrad snapped shut. The northern and southern Soviet spearheads met near Kalach. Some 290,000 Axis soldiers, the German Sixth Army, first among them, were now sealed inside. The door had been forced open at exactly the spot Dumitrescu had pointed to for 3 months, and forced by tanks the Romanian guns could not touch. Where the two spearheads finally closed the gap, near the village of Sovetski, tank crews from separate Soviet fronts rolled up onto the same ground. Only days before, that ground had been the Romanian rear. Now it had no one left to hold it, and the ring stood as solid steel. Inside the Lascar pocket, the days that followed were a slow subtraction. Each dawn there was less. Less bread, then no bread. Fewer shells, then almost none. The wounded could not be moved and could not be treated. The cold did its own quiet killing, patient and steady, taking fingers and feet from men who had no shelter on open ground. There was no line anymore in any real sense. Just shrinking islands of men firing off their last rounds and then waiting for the end to reach them. The Lascar group did not last long after that. There was nothing to last on. Out of ammunition, out of food, cut into smaller and smaller pieces, it was ground down over the following days. General Lascar himself was taken prisoner on the 22nd of November, the same day his men refused to quit. He would spend the rest of the war in Soviet captivity from 1943 to 1945. By the 26th of November, about a week after Uranus began, the Lascar group had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 40,000 men, gone in roughly 4 days. Not all killed. Many marched off into the long Soviet prison columns that swallowed the Stalingrad pocket. Gone as an army erased from the board. A few got out, and they are worth naming because their escape measures exactly how thin the survival was. A major named George Rascanescu, leading a battalion of the 15th Infantry Regiment, refused to simply dissolve. He kept his men together and fought his way west, all the way to the Chir River with his soldiers and his equipment intact. Then he turned and helped hold an airfield at Oblivskaya from the 26th of November into early December, keeping one small door open at the back of the disaster. A cavalry officer, General Radu Korn, pulled together a scratch detachment of horse regiments and artillery and threw it into counterattacks to slow the flood. These were real soldiers doing real soldiering. There were just far too few of them, far too late, against far too much. Count the whole bill. Between the 19th of November and early January, the two Romanian armies caught in the Stalingrad catastrophe lost on the order of 150,000 men, dead, wounded and missing. The Third Army, the army on the northern flank, the army this story has followed, lost all but about 5% of its combat troops. Let that number sit. 95 out of every 100 fighting men. There is no polite word for what happened to the Romanian Third Army. It was not defeated. It was taken off the map. Its ability to fight offensively on the Eastern Front was finished for the rest of the war in a single week. And here is the part that turns a defeat into an injustice. The Romanians had said all of this would happen. Dumitrescu had begged for months to clear the bridgeheads. The warnings were on paper, in the files of the German High Command, ignored. The guns were known to be useless before the battle, and nobody replaced them in time. The one order that might have saved 40,000 men, the order to break out, was refused. The Romanians were placed where they could not win, told to hold with what could not hold, and then, when it collapsed exactly as predicted, they were the ones blamed for it. The fence took the fall for the men who built it. And the blame landed fast, and it landed on the Romanians. In German accounts, the flank simply gave way, as though the men holding it had chosen to fail. Little was said about the 6 real anti-tank guns per division, or the 85-mile fronts, or the 3 months of warnings filed and ignored. For Romania, the cost ran far past a single battle. The best of its army was spent in that snow. 2 full armies wrecked in about 7 weeks. A country that had marched east as Hitler's proudest partner came out of Stalingrad with its striking power broken, and it never rebuilt that power for the German cause. Less than 2 years later, Romania would turn its guns clean around and join the other side. The road to that turn ran straight through the Don, through 40,000 men told to hold a line that could not be held. So go back to that frozen morning and look at it straight. The most famous encirclement in the history of war, the trap that ate an entire German army and turned the whole Eastern War around, did not begin with a blow against the Germans. It began with a blow against the men standing next to them. The Soviet planners looked at the ring around Stalingrad and they did the one thing the Germans never expected an enemy to bother doing. They aimed at the ally. and it worked so well that within weeks they ran the same play again farther west, in Operation Little Saturn, this time tearing open the Italian Eighth Army on the Don. The lesson the Red Army carried off that ground was plain. Break the satellite, and the German standing behind him breaks too. That is the fact the standard telling leaves out. Everyone remembers the German Sixth Army freezing to death in the ruins of Stalingrad. Almost no one remembers that its grave was dug 40 miles to the northwest in the snow by the destruction of 40,000 Romanians who had warned that this was coming and were made to stand there anyway. The cauldron that caught the Germans was not set by aiming at the Germans. It was set by aiming at their friends. The Red Army understood that a chain breaks at its weakest link. The Germans had built their whole eastern flank out of the weakest link they had, and then looked the other way. And in 4 days on the Don, the Red Army handed them the bill for it.